Hi, I'm Randy Cantrell. Welcome to the Year of the Peer podcast with Leo Batari. This podcast is based on a simple truth. Who you surround yourself with matters. Author and keynote speaker Leo Batari will interview thought leaders from all walks of life who will share how they leverage peer advantage and show you how engaging your peers more purposefully can hold the key to greater success in business and in life. Today's guest is Dr. Linda Darling-Hammond. Linda Darling-Hammond is the Charles E. Ducommun Professor of Education Emeritus at Stanford University. Last year, she became the founding president for the Learning Policy Institute, which conducts and communicates independent, high-quality research to improve education policy and practice. In 2008, she served as director of President Obama's Education Policy Transition Team. Among Darling-Hammond's more than 500 publications are The Flat World and Education, How America's Commitment to Equity Will Determine Our Future, winner of the coveted 2012 Grawemeyer Award in Education. Her most recent books include Getting Teacher Evaluation Right, What Really Matters for Effectiveness and Improvement, published in 2013, and Beyond the Bubble Test, How Performance Assessments Support 21st Century Learning, published in 2014. We welcome Dr. Darling-Hammond to the program.
Dr. Darling-Hammond, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here.
You know, in the introduction, of course, when you think about all of that you've written about education, it would probably be fair to say that you've written about it more than most people have read about it, which is why we're so pleased and really fortunate to have you here on the program today. And I guess I want to start, when we think about the Year of the Peer and the value that we bring to one another, I want to talk with you a little bit about what you've asserted many times, which is the value and importance of learning how to learn together.
Yeah. And, that's true for children in schools. There's a mountain of research on collaborative learning and cooperative learning. And done well, it is more effective in enabling students to both get the assistance they need as they're learning and to solve problems at a higher level of sophistication. Now, that does require sophisticated teaching because you have to know how to organize group-worthy tasks and set roles for students and enable them to learn to do that work. We've all had bad experiences with group work when somebody just throws a bunch of people at a problem and, one person does all the work and the other people sit and watch, et cetera. But that's because quite often the pedagogical practices that are needed are not in place. But when they are, peers learn beautifully together, and you see that with kids when they're playing and when they're doing things together outside of schools. The same is then true also for teachers, who, as it turns out, benefit enormously from collaboration. We have evidence both internationally and from studies in the U.S. that teachers are more effective when they are enabled to meet and plan and talk regularly and give feedback to one another, that they stay in the profession longer under those circumstances, that they feel more efficacious, that they're more likely to engage in more challenging kinds of practices that are aimed at higher order thinking skills and problem solving for students. So collaboration is really the name of the game in terms of moving education systems forward. Teaching is a team sport, not just an individual act.
I would imagine, too, that it has changed over the years. To date myself a little, I was probably in elementary school in the late 60s and junior high school and high school in the 70s. And I think I mentioned this to another guest, too. Collaborative learning would have been regarded as cheating back when I was in school, right? Everyone was shading their papers and they were doing all these things, and it was really all about very much focused on the individual effort. So when did that change? When collaboration started to become a greater part of the way students started to learn together?
Well, I think we began to see work around collaboration in the 60s and 70s, and a lot of research was done, but it didn't become a widespread practice probably until about the 1990s, when there was just enormous amount of work going on all across the world on how to support collaborative learning. But it's still not everywhere. I mean, we still have people who have the old sit in the rows and do your own thing and shield your paper from others. And our testing culture kind of encourages this idea that collaboration is cheating rather than collaboration is learning. So we're still in process on it, but much of the world, particularly high-achieving countries, has moved very definitively and universally in this direction. And the international tests, the Pisa tests, now have a test on collaborative problem solving. So it's become much more accepted in the world as a way to learn and a fundamental skill for lifelong success and learning.
So this PISA program for international student assessment, some of our audience may not be as familiar with the Pisa scores. So if you could talk a little bit about, just set the framework for that. We can talk about some of the countries that are doing really, really well, and particularly with regard to collaboration and where others can do better.
So the PISA test is actually interesting because it's a little bit different from U.S. tests, which usually just try to test, usually in multiple choice format, whether you can remember something or recall it or, use a formula. In the PISA test, they're really looking at whether you can apply knowledge to new situations. So they test science, mathematics, reading, and now they're introducing collaborative problem solving. And the answers are usually open-ended. People have to apply what they know to figure something else out and explain their answer. On these assessments, U.S. students generally do not do well and have been dropping ever since the year 2000 when they were introduced. Even as we've done more and more and more multiple choice testing under No Child Left Behind, our scores on these international assessments have been dropping. So we are now somewhere below 30th in both math and science, I believe, in the most recent one, and somewhere around 20th in the world in reading and literacy. Now, there are two factors there. One is that we're not organizing enough of our instruction around those kinds of skills. The second is that we do have higher rates of child poverty and under-resourcing of schools that serve those children than high-achieving countries do as well.
So, but, and my understanding from the 2015 results is Singapore did particularly well. They topped all three categories, I believe, right? Math, science, and reading this year. Yeah, it was really extraordinary. But I think, as much as we know and have heard about countries like Singapore and Finland and all in terms of their education systems, we also really don't have to look too far also. We have a neighbor to the north who scores very, very well on PISA. And how do you maybe evaluate Canada's success in that regard?
I thought you might even be talking about Massachusetts, but
that's true, right? That's right. They did.
We'll talk about Canada first. Canada is interesting because it actually has a much higher proportion of immigrants than the U.S. About 25% in Ontario of young people are immigrants, and across the country it's a higher rate. They don't have a heavy federal role in education. It's run by the provinces, but they do invest in teachers. They typically also support them and treat them better. They fund schools more equitably within the provinces than many of our states do. And they have been very proactive in trying to figure out how to support both better instruction for First Nations people and a variety of other equity reforms in their schools.
Well, you mentioned investing in teachers, and I think that from my view, at least, and from the little I've looked at it by comparison to what you have, but when you think about countries where they really invest heavily in teacher education and development versus countries that spend money in testing, you imagine that's not even a fair fight. Right? If you have money that's actually going into the actual education of teachers and students versus just trying to count our poker chips to see how we did kind of at the end, it doesn't seem that that would be very easy to compete, in that regard, and that there's a tremendous advantage there for people who would invest on the front end.
Yeah, Leo, actually, it's funny that you should mention this, and I want to just make it clear that we did not pre-plan this part of the conversation.
Okay.
I jotted down something you wrote in a blog a couple of years ago because I thought it was so on point with respect to this issue. You said, imagine your competitor investing in improving its leadership team and its products while you guys are creating more dashboards to measure why you're losing market share.
Yeah.
And that's really kind of what's been going on in the United States. It's that we've been spending enormous amount of time and money on testing, focused on very low-level skills, which has kind of narrowed the curriculum and driven it in many ways in the wrong direction for a 21st century society and economy where you need to have kids problem solving and critical thinking and analyzing and synthesizing and and actually doing the kind of science and technology that they need to learn. While other countries, Singapore among them, Finland and others, have been really aiming towards a very different kind of curriculum and assessment, much less testing, much more of it is open-ended, even project-based, where kids are given a challenge to design a scientific investigation and collect data and write about it, while our kids are sitting there kind of bubbling in, and we're spending millions and millions of dollars perfecting the skill of bubbling in, but ignoring many of the skills that kids actually need to be effective in today's society.
Part of what makes collaboration work, though, is really being able to listen to one another and respect one another. And we're kind of coming off of a presidential campaign, which is kind of the culmination, I think, of a lot that's happened in our society over the last decade, where we debate more than dialogue, by far, and we're not listening. We're not doing what Covey said, right? Seek first to understand and then to be understood. And it was interesting because in just a few days ago, the Edelman Trust Barometer results came out. And one of the things that they said was that people are 4 times more likely to ignore information that supports a position that they don't believe in. So I guess when we think about not only the example we give to our students, but just for adults as well, how do we get better at that? How do we finally teach ourselves as a society to be more open, to listen more, to respect other people's opinions? Because we can have all the collaboration in the world, but if we're not willing to engage in that behavior, either as children or adults, we're not going to be particularly effective.
Yeah, and I think we've lost ground on that in a couple of ways if you look at the society as a whole. One is that our media now is very, very bifurcated. So,
Yes.
You watch MSNBC or you watch Fox News or whatever, and you get a particular way of looking at the world. There used to be in our federal policies something called the Fairness Doctrine. And if you think back to Walter Cronkite or, some of the old anchors on the news, the idea was that you would really present evidence on both sides of the issue. You would let people see the evidence themselves and take it in and think about it, and you would always provide some discussion of both sides of the issue. That was eliminated back in the 1980s, along with some rules that required diversity of media ownership. So now our media is owned by a very small number of people, not at all subject to a fairness doctrine, and we're getting a kind of discourse that is very narrow and not helping people learn to listen to each other and then think about the pros and cons. The other thing is that during the No Child Left Behind era in schools, after this federal law was passed that drove us to triple testing that was federally mandated and really focus on reading and math scores on those tests, then we found a lot of schools that eliminated science, social studies, civics. That part of the curriculum got squeezed way down. We lost the kind of robust expectation that kids in schools would be learning to be citizens and engaged in that civic discourse and learning how to weigh and balance ideas. And it became just about getting these very narrow test scores on these multiple choice forms of testing, which actually is cognitively asking people not to think about various interpretations And how might you approach this? And what might be the ways to think about something that's complex? Because it's really saying there's one right answer. We're going to give you 5 choices. You don't even have to think about what the answers might be. And your job is to choose one that someone else has predetermined for you. And that's a very, frankly, a dangerous form of cognition if that's all you're doing day in and day out. And I think we have to rebuild our capacity to have this kind of thinking discourse in schools and in society across all the areas that we have to deal with.
So when we look at some of the schools around the world, and we think about countries that do collaborative learning really, really well, who are they and what is it about how they do what they do that's so effective?
Well, one thing that's often true in education is that if you want something to occur for children, you should make sure that it's occurring as well for teachers, because teachers can take what they have experienced and translate it to kids. It's very rare that you can get the one without the other. So let me talk about collaboration among teachers first and then talk about students. One of the things that they do in places like Singapore, for example, is they have, out of the 40-hour work week for teachers, somewhere between 15 and 20 hours is time for teachers to collaborate with each other. They're teaching kids about, I think, 19 hours a week. And then they are working with each other on planning lessons, on lesson study where they develop something together. One teacher might implement it in the classroom while the others watch and look at how the kids are doing and collect data, come back and talk about how to fine-tune the lesson. Somebody else tries it and they're observed. They may do action research together where they take up a problem of teaching and try a new teaching strategy and see what happens and write it up and share it with each other. They may be in and out of each other's classrooms, observing and giving feedback. That's all structured into the workday for teachers. In the United States, our teachers are still on the old factory model from the early 1900s. So our teachers teach more hours per year than teachers anywhere else in the world. Wow. And more hours per week with fewer breaks and less opportunity to work together. And they have less planning time than most other countries. And the planning time is typically individual. So you might get 3, 4, 5 hours a week as a U.S. teacher to plan your lessons and run your dittos or get your videos ready. But rarely are you scheduled with other teachers to jointly decide how to design the curriculum, how to design assessments. So that kind of work means that the lessons that teachers do offer in places like Singapore or Shanghai, you could talk about Finland as well, are very, very thoughtfully designed. There's been a lot of problem solving around what's the best way to represent the concept, what's the best assignment to give to kids, what kind of supports would kids need. And then when the teaching has occurred, teachers can come back together and continue to improve it. That also then translates into work that kids are doing. And in many of these countries, kids are also very explicitly collaborating. In Singapore, just to continue on that for a moment, among the assessments that kids have to do as part of their formal assessment program is a collaborative project where kids together have to take up a problem and figure out how to approach it together. And that's actually, in lieu of a multiple choice test, that's actually one of the formal assessments that they turn in and teachers are trained to score them on. So they value collaboration so much they bring it right into the assessment system.
Wow. I'd like people to know too that in addition to you're being an educational scholar, you started as a public school teacher. And how often do you draw on that experience?
I'm sorry?
I said, how often do you draw on that experience as a public school teacher as you are, doing your work and evaluating?
All the time. And I went from teaching in public school. I started a preschool and daycare center some years ago. I started a public high school more recently in a high-need community near Stanford. And then I've worked with a lot of teachers and principals who've started new schools. to help them design the features of the schools. I think you have to connect everything you do back to practice. And I have enormous respect and regard for practitioners because it's such complex, sophisticated work to take a group of students and really understand how they learn and bring them along towards high levels of learning. So I think it informs the way I think about the research as well.
Sure. And with that, very recently, wasn't it just last year that you started the Learning Policy Institute? So I'd love to hear what inspired you to do that and talk a little bit about the work that you're starting right now.
Well, I've worked in the policy arena quite a bit. Over the years, I've worked with legislators and governors, and I helped run President Obama's transition team in 2008 around the policies for the administration. And one of the things that's become clear over the years is that, number one, a lot of policy doesn't treat learning, and it doesn't come from an understanding of the kind of learning we need in the 21st century, which is this kind of collaboration and communication and problem solving and ability to learn on one's own, and et cetera. And policy is often hostile to that kind of learning. There are all kinds of rules and regulations and ways of doing things that keep the old factory model in place. Secondly, evidence about what works for learning rarely makes its way into the policy conversation. So the Learning Policy Institute exists to do two things: to focus on how would we get a system of equitable and empowering learning for all children, and secondly, to assemble research and organize evidence and carry it directly into the policy arena to work with legislators, state and federal agency officials and others in districts, et cetera, who are trying to build a system that will work for what we really need today.
And what we see in business too, I think is kind of interesting in that I think the last figures I looked at, corporations are spending about $130 billion on executive education and development and all. And yet we've got a system that's very kind of event oriented. People go away, they go to their training for a couple of days, they come back, they have to catch up on everything they missed while they were gone. And the next thing you know, they're back in the flow of what their responsibilities are, because there are fewer people oftentimes doing more work. And with that, it seems that when we don't have the learning and the doing, intertwined in such a way which actually allows us to take that learning and embed it into practice, that seems to be just a really difficult situation, and not sure how we're ever going to see the ROI unless we get away from that factory model that you talk about, and that we start doing what you talked about happens in Singapore, when we start making collaboration a part of what we do, not apart from what we do, right?
Yeah. Exactly. And you sound a little like John Dewey, who
loved him.
The idea of an educator in early 1900s, that experience and education have to go together, that people learn by doing and by thinking. It's the doing and the reflecting together. That is how human beings have always learned, is by inquiring and then reflecting on what they've found, and then inventing and building on those inventions. And when we in school separate experience from education and say sit at a desk and listen to somebody else tell you things, we're really reducing the amount of serious learning that can go on that will transfer to other settings outside of school. So it's a long time problem, and I think we have some schools making real headway on this, but we have to break the idea that education is sitting at a desk, just taking in what somebody else says rather than trying, doing, inquiring, investigating, applying the learning.
Well, that's what I love what you're doing with the Learning Policy Institute also, in that I think the work really shines a light on what it's going to take not only to attract more teachers, but how to retain them. And you talk a lot about that. If you can create that collaborative environment, that kind of excitement and energy around the teaching profession, we're going to do a whole lot better of bringing more people, to it and having them stay longer.
Absolutely. And we see that. I mean, there are some wonderful teacher education programs. And we did some work on redesigning the program at Stanford, but there are many of them around the world and the country where teachers are in the classroom the whole time that they're in the program, under the wing of a master teacher. All of the coursework for learning to teach is applied to what you're doing in the classroom, so theory and practice together. And what you end up with is very powerful learning. People graduate and go into practice with a year of practice under their belts, but all of this intertwined understanding of learning and curriculum and development that carries them through a long career in the profession, being very efficacious, always able to continue to learn, always able to continue to improve. That's what we have to be willing to invest in for all of our teachers, and it's what we see in these other countries. The book that we're just putting out on empowered educators across the world in 5 high-achieving countries finds those kinds of investments are fundamental to the system as a whole.
Well, it's exactly where I was going, because I was thinking about that work and how it must have inspired this idea of empowering educators. So if you could, because I know that book only comes out in a few weeks now, so it'll be really terrific. I'm looking forward to reading it, certainly. But definitely tell us a little bit about what we can expect from that and what you hope maybe is some of the outcomes from people who read it.
Well, we went to 5 countries in several jurisdictions within them, China, Shanghai in particular, Singapore, Finland, Canada, looking at Alberta and Ontario in particular, and Australia, looking in particular at New South Wales and Victoria. Some of these are places very much like the United States, and some are different in a variety of cultural ways, but you find very common threads in how have they built a system in which teachers are well prepared, well supported, highly effective, where you don't see this variability across classrooms to the extent that we do in the United States. And I think what is interesting, and I hope people will take from this, is of course, anytime you look at another country, you can't just take what they do and apply it in your own place without thinking through what fits, what makes sense, how would we do that here. But I think you can see these common threads where, first of all, teachers are recruited into very high-quality teacher education programs. They go to school for free or at a greatly reduced cost, so preponderantly paid by the government. Sometimes with a stipend or a salary while they're training. So everyone gets the same high quality training rather than people getting only as much training as they can afford to get. They're paid comparably to other professions rather than in the US where teachers are paid about 20% less on average than other professions, even after you account for the difference in the work year. They are mentored from the beginning by expert teachers who are also trained to be good mentors to bring them into the profession. They participate in these collegial work groups, research groups, and other lesson study groups and peer-to-peer planning groups throughout their career. They have time to do that. And what you get at the end of the day with a system in which all the pieces work together is a profession of teachers who are there for the long-term career. In the U.S., we have a lot of in and out. We have a lot of churn, high attrition rates in teaching because we don't treat teachers very well once we get them there, and we don't support that practice in a way that works for everyone. And they get higher achievement as a result. So we hope that the examples, we have very vivid examples from what the specific practices are in these countries, will be helpful to those in the United States. Almost all of the ideas that other countries are working on came from the US. They were invented here, and they were scaled up and taken seriously in these other countries. So we have to really think about how do we build systems at the state level primarily, where we will take advantage of what we know and address the Achilles heel of inequality that is really the thing that brings the U.S. down. We don't resource schools equitably for children. We don't provide equitably prepared teachers, equally well-prepared teachers and administrators to all communities. That's actually what building a system would require us to do. A single system that is effective for all kids. So that's our challenge.
So what's interesting about that, though, and as you mentioned with Pisa scores and how we've been dropping, it is a different story for higher education, though, isn't that true? Where higher education in the U.S. is actually at a really high level compared with the rest of the world. Why are we that much better at it in terms of higher education than K through 12?
Well, one of the things is that we put a lot more resources into higher education relative to K-12 in recent years, and we, for many years, put more resources into higher ed than many other countries, although many are catching up and investing a great deal more in tertiary education. They're also getting more of their populations through college, into and through college in many countries than is now true for the U.S. That's primarily because we used to have financial aid that was comparable to the cost of a public institution. And the financial aid has both decreased from the federal government, and the state investments in public higher education have also decreased. So it's becoming less affordable. Nonetheless, the quality of many of our institutions is very, very high. And it is sought after. People come from all over the world to try to get higher education in the United States, not only at the very famous institutions that, people hear about all around the world, but at the flagship public institutions and throughout the system. And why is it such high quality offerings? I think it's a combination of the fact that the higher ed system actually has been to a substantial degree allowed to govern itself and has not been as highly regulated. Now, we're running into some problems now as for-profit proprietary schools are coming into the market and not regulating themselves to as high a quality standard. But previous to that, which is the last 10 years, accreditation processes and other kinds of processes have really enabled innovative, thoughtful, high quality work to go on in higher education.
So I'm going to return to kind of where we started a little bit for a final question, and that is about learning how to learn together. We've talked about our society. We've talked about how things have kind of broken down in that regard and how things have gotten so segmented with people getting to watch the news they want and not always being accustomed to being open to new ideas and listening. How can any listener, each of us, whether it's with our kids or ourselves or with our colleagues, how can we do a better job of creating a culture where we are really listening for understanding and that we are doing a better job of learning how to learn together?
I think part of it comes from starting with questions rather than answers. So whether you're going into a conversation in your family or you're in a formal learning situation, we need to help children and adults learn how to ask questions to advance their understanding. We're very focused on answers, here's the problem or the test item or whatever, what's the answer? And we do much less support for inquiring with questions. So I think that's a big part of it, is learning again to ask questions, to listen for answers, to figure out how to inquire and look for evidence and information and answers, and then weigh and balance that, seek additional input to come to reasoned conclusions. And ways of looking at the world. That's one of the things we can do in schools, is really organize some of the work in schools around questioning. And that, if you think about the human experience, that's what human beings have done from the beginning. Every single thing we have discovered and invented, whether it was, how to make fire, or, the fact that if you drop certain kinds of food in the fire that were raw, they come out tasting better when they're cooked in certain ways. I don't know who figured out, fried foods and sauteed foods, but all of that came from human inquiry, investigation, questioning, looking for answers, and inventing. And you look around us at all that human beings have created in this world that we now need to be smart enough to preserve in the decades ahead, so that there is a human race and there is a planet. All of that came from questioning and investigating and looking for answers, and that's what we're good at. So we need to bring that into the way we educate and the way we communicate with each other.
Well, thank you so much. I think the idea of all of us asking better questions is certainly terrific advice. And I want to remind our listeners too, Empowered Educators. It comes out in the next couple of weeks. Hope you're looking forward to reading it as much as I will. And thank you so much, Dr. Linda Darling-Hammond, for joining us today. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thanks for joining us today. To learn more about Peer Advantage, to submit questions to Leo and our guest, and to subscribe to the Year of the Peer podcast, please visit us at leobottary.com. It's leobottary.com. This podcast is produced by me, Randy Cantrell, hosted, of course, by Leo Bottary. Music provided by Kevin MacLeod, Vibe Ace. Licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 3.0 license.